Hi, this is Lou Pulsifer with another Nuts and Bolts of Game Design screencast about scaling up and down for differing numbers of players. By scaling, I mean a game almost always has an ideal number of players. That's the number that gives the most satisfactory game, where the game works best. Whether you intended that or not, the game naturally has it. The question is, how well can you make the game work for less than ideal numbers? For example, many card games work best for 4 or 5 players. Can you make it work well for 6, for 3, maybe even for 2? And I'm talking about independent players here. I'm not talking about partners. Going down to 2 is tough. The game can become deterministic, kind of like chess. If the players are the primary interest in the game and not the game system, then with 2 players, there's not much interest. There's only one other player from anybody's point of view. This is not so hard for parallel competitions or what's called multiplayer solitaire as it is for interactive games. Going down to 3, you can run into the petty diplomacy problem, again in interactive games. The player who's convinced they will lose may be able to determine who wins. Going up, especially from 2 to a larger number, can be limited by board capacity. Length can become a problem. Downtime can become a problem. So I'm going to talk about each of these at somewhat greater length and at the risk of repeating myself. If your game is a perfect information game, such as my prototype game IMM, then at 2 it becomes chess-like. It becomes a puzzle. And it takes a lot longer as players try to figure out the best move in the deterministic game. If the game is interactive, the players may be the primary interest, and again, if you reduce to just one player, other than the focus player, much of the interest may be gone. If the game is like so many Euros, where you play your own puzzle and almost entirely ignore the other players, then reducing to 2 is easier. Although, my observation is, even though many Euros are designed for 2 to 4 players, I very rarely see them being played by 2 people. Going down to 3 can be a problem if the game is interactive. If it's not interactive, then it'll probably work just fine. Wayne Schmidberger calls the problem the petty diplomacy problem, and that's diplomacy with a non-capital D, not the game diplomacy. If one player decides they can't win, then by throwing themselves against the second player, they may be able to ensure that the third player wins. That's the petty diplomacy problem. And it's pretty hard to counteract. Now, I said the board could be a limitation. Now, I'm talking about true board games, that is, games that use the board to depict maneuver, placement, and geospatial relationships. Games that use a board as a status tracker, that is a substitute for something else, you can track that status other ways. In other words, a board game that's cosmetically a board game rather than functionally, you rarely have the limitation. To take some examples, diplomacy is a kind of historical 7-player game. It's very difficult to fit fewer than 7 players into that board, partly because of how it's shaped, partly because of the tie with history. In Britannia and other Brit-like games, to take another historical game, then the board combined with the combinations of nations and points makes it difficult to make the game for other numbers of players. There are some decent 3-player versions of some Britannia-like games, and I have a simplified intro version of Britannia 3rd edition that appears to work for 2 to 5, but I had to simplify the points immensely. The points aren't anything like they are in epic historical Britannia. But the points and the board are sort of a combination of the same thing. Length can be a limitation. This is more likely when you try to increase the number of players from 2, because if the game is the right length for 2, It may become way too long for more than 2, especially 5 or more. Also, games designed for 2 are simply differently designed than those designed for more than 2, and that will be the subject of another screencast sometime. I have a co-op Space War game for 1 to 4 that I tried with 5 on a larger board because the main board was too small. It worked, but it took too long. And that's always the problem. As you add more players, does it take too long? Downtime can also be a limitation. Now, downtime is time people wait for somebody else to take their turn. This happens most often in card games. Unless each player's turn is unusually quick, then as there are more players in the game, you have a greater accumulation of downtime as other players take their turns. And finally it becomes too much. So 5 or 6 players is often the limit for a card game. You know, the mechanics could handle more if you might have to add more cards, but there's so much downtime that it's undesirable. In my game Sea Kings, which is cards and a board for maneuver, I recommend 2 actions per player rather than 3 as you move up towards 6 players. In one of my prototypes, I allow just 1 action per player, and that can accommodate 8. In other words, 7 actions of downtime. But if I gave 2 actions per player, then with 8 you'd have 14 actions of downtime, and that would be too much. Going up from 2 is really hard because a game with more players will last much longer, as I said. I had a Space War game, lots of neat scenarios, fascinating space battles, plays fairly quickly, but it was for 2 players. And it was play tested that way until I encountered a group that wanted to play with up to 5. So they did, and it took several hours, much longer than many people would want to play a game, but they enjoyed it. And so I altered the multiplayer rules to try to speed it up with submissions and some other things that would get the game on to an ending. I'd never have made it for more than 2 on my own. You can have other problems. I have a race game where players try to get from one side of the hexagonally shaped board, crossing in the middle, and that's normally for 3 or 4. But for 6, the rules needed to be changed. I had to allow ships to move through opposing ships rather than be blocked. Otherwise, it was one big traffic jam, and the capture rules couldn't ameliorate that sufficiently. Of course, variable setups for various numbers of players is quite desirable. Often you want to change the setup to keep the total of units at the start nearly the same, and the empty space on the board near the same, so that even though there are more players, you're not changing so much how the game is played at the start. There are other possible limitations. There may be financial limitations, components mainly. If you keep adding players, you have to add more components. And the physical side of the size of the board to accommodate the pieces. A 17 by 22 board that's good for 2 players might not be good for 4 or 5. And of course, if you add more players, you've got to do more testing to check out how the game works with those players. So the wider the range of players a game will accommodate, the more testing, play testing you have to do. And sometimes it just doesn't work. Munchkin, for example, a very popular game, is okay with 3 players, but not really with 4, and it's bad with 5+. Why? Severe leader bashing. The game ends up taking twice as long as it ought to. Now, I've watched college-age people play the game, and despite the leader bashing, they seem to enjoy it because of the horse trading that's involved when you're ganging up on somebody and then deciding how to split up the loot. But as a game, it's a severe leader bashing problem, and it's pointless. Now, the coin series of insurgency games takes a 2-sided situation and tries to expand it to 4. That is really hard. I don't care for it. I don't think it works, but the games are quite popular. Partners adds players but not independent sides, so it has its own dynamics. Usually you have a two-player or two-sided game that is played by four, two sets of two partners. I once, in desperation, a need to accommodate 10 at a playtesting session, tried a five-sided game with partners, 10 people. It was the first time the game had been played by other people. Yeah, it can be done, but I don't recommend it. So each game has its own quirks. There's a lot to cope with, and you have to think about it and plan for it from the start. If you try to, say, make a two-player game and then turn it into a game for 4 or 5, then it's really difficult. Thanks for listening.